Good morning and welcome to Sharper Iron. Spend the next hour with us studying the living and active Word of God, His two-edged sword of law and gospel, recorded for you in Holy Scripture, all about Jesus Christ, crucified, risen, and ascended for you. Thanks for tuning in this morning here on Worldwide KFUO. Christ for you, anytime, anywhere. I am your host, Pastor Timothy Appel of Grace Lutheran Church in Smithville, Texas. Thank you to our generous underwriters on Sharper Iron, the Lutheran Church Extension Fund, where your investments help support the work of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. Visit lcef.org for more information. And Luther Classical College, a college for Lutherans by Lutherans, opening in fall 2025. Learn more at lutherclassical.org. On this Thursday, October 13th, we are studying Joshua chapter 4, verses 1 to 24. Now that Israel has entered the promised land, the Lord has his people set up a memorial to remind them of how he led them across the Jordan River. To help us sharpen our faith in Christ as we study God's Word today, we have with us regular guest, Pastor Luke Zimmerman. Pastor Zimmerman serves at Calvary Evangelical Lutheran Church in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. Pastor Zimmerman, welcome back to Sharper Iron.
It's going to be back on Sharper Iron.
Pastor Zimmerman, as we get started, give us some context. We looked at Joshua chapter 3 today, and yesterday Pastor Poppy reminded us that really chapters 3 and 4 go together, that we really need to hear them together. So what should we know as we prepare to look at this text?
All right, yeah. So our chapter numbers are always a little bit artificial. So sometimes you have to wonder how they got assigned exactly, because sometimes we would, some of us might think like one whole event might want to be one chapter, put it all in one chapter. That's not what happened when those chapter numbers were installed much later, much after the scriptures themselves were written. But the Jordan River crossing really kind of fits all of chapter 3 and all of chapter 4 in what we call the book of Joshua. So you have the details given about what the Israelites are going to do. So kind of chapter 3 tells you what is going to happen as the Lord reveals to Joshua how this great number of Israelites is going to get across a river that's actually in a flood stage. And some of our listeners are probably familiar with rivers and flood stages. It's like, you don't know exactly where the banks are anymore because they're covered. And usually in a flood stage, the river is going to be very fast flowing. There might even be debris in it. And it's like, that's the last thing you want to do is step foot in there. But the Lord has revealed to Joshua that we're going to be able to get you across this river because I, the Lord, am going to do something great for you. In fact, what I'm going to do, it will actually exalt you, Joshua. It's actually going to be a way that Joshua's position as the leader of the Israelites is confirmed. It becomes another way that the Israelites see the Lord's action being used for them, and it kind of sets itself as a bookend to another water crossing that was at the very beginning of their journey out of Egypt into the Promised Land. So what we're going to be looking at in chapter 4 is the actual crossing being completed, and then an interesting instruction that the Lord gives through Joshua for the Israelites to have a way to always remember this great, powerful, divine action that the Lord took for their benefit, so that his people could actually take possession of the land that was promised to them. And so that's kind of where we are in this. So the details from our last episode kind of gives you the instructions of what they're going to do, how this is going to work, how the River Jordan actually is stopped by the Lord. And now in our chapter we're going to look at today, we're going to see how the Israelites actually complete this act that the Lord assigns to them, and then how they also do something significant to remember this act that the Lord helped perform for them.
In the previous chapter, in Joshua 3, verse 16, it did say that the people passed over opposite Jericho. And so the introduction that you gave, I think, is very helpful, because we see just kind of the style of the book of Joshua in this, and you see it in other books of the scriptures as well, where something is said to have happened, but then the author will go back and describe in more detail certain things that happened in that event, such that, wait a second, I thought they crossed. Well, yes, but we need to find out more about that event. And so we're going to kind of backtrack a little bit to get some of those details. But by the end of this chapter, the people are all going to be on the other side of the Jordan River. So again, we need that full context so that we can see what happens here in chapter 4 and other ways that are memorializing what happened. So we are picking up the text, Joshua chapter 4, beginning at the first verse. When all the nation had finished passing over the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, "Take 12 men from the people, from each tribe a man, and command them, saying, Take 12 stones from here out of the midst of the Jordan, from the very place where the priest's feet stood firmly, and bring them over with you and lay them down in the place where you lodge tonight." Then Joshua called the 12 men from the people of Israel, whom he had appointed, a man from each tribe. And Joshua said to them, "Pass on before the ark of the Lord your God into the midst of the Jordan, and take up each of you a stone upon his shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of the people of Israel, that this may be a sign among you. When your children ask in time to come, 'What do those stones mean to you?' then you shall tell them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it passed over the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. So these stones shall be to the people of Israel a memorial forever." And the people of Israel did just as Joshua commanded, and took up 12 stones out of the midst of the Jordan, according to the number of the tribes of the people of Israel, just as the Lord told Joshua. And they carried them over with them to the place where they lodged, and laid them down there. And Joshua set up 12 stones in the midst of the Jordan, in the place where the feet of the priests bearing the ark of the covenant had stood, and they are there to this day. For the priests bearing the ark stood in the midst of the Jordan until everything was finished that the Lord commanded Joshua to tell the people, according to all that Moses had commanded Joshua. The people passed over in haste. And when all the people had finished passing over, the ark of the Lord and the priests passed over before the people. The sons of Reuben and the sons of Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh passed over armed before the people of Israel as Moses had told them. About 40,000 ready for war passed over before the Lord for battle, to the plains of Jericho. On that day the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they stood in awe of him just as they had stood in awe of Moses all the days of his life. The Lord said to Joshua, "Command the priests bearing the ark of the testimony to come up out of the Jordan." So Joshua commanded the priests, "Come up out of the Jordan." And when the priests bearing the ark of the covenant of the Lord came up from the midst of the Jordan, and the soles of the priests' feet were lifted up on dry ground, the waters of the Jordan returned to their place and overflowed all its banks, as before. The people came up out of the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month, and they encamped at Gilgal on the east border of Jericho. And those 12 stones, which they took out of the Jordan, Joshua set up at Gilgal. And he said to the people of Israel, "When your children ask their fathers in times to come, 'What do these stones mean?' then you shall let your children know, Israel passed over this Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan for you until you passed over, as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, which he dried up for us until we passed over, so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, that you may fear the Lord your God forever." That's our text for today. That is Joshua 4, verses 1 to 24. All right, so Pastor Zimmerman, in the first few verses, we hear again, the nation finished passing over the Jordan. So we're thinking about the nation traveling over throughout this text, and the detail that we want to first pay attention to is the Lord's command to get some stones out of the Jordan River. What's going on in these first couple of verses?
Okay, so what the Lord is instructing Joshua to do is to establish ultimately a memorial to this event that the Lord performed for his people. Now, we're going to start seeing these details kind of kind of drip out in the text. So we're going to have first the instructions of who's going to be involved with setting up this memorial. And then you're going to have Joshua giving the instructions to these people who are going to help establish the memorial. And then by the end of the chapter, you're going to have the memorial set up. Okay, so there's kind of a flow to it as we're tracing through the chapter. Because this is remembering an event that the Lord was doing for his nation of Israel. And of course, the way Israel is often referred to are they are descendants of the sons of Jacob. Remember, Jacob gets that name Israel in Genesis. That becomes kind of the second name by which he's known. And his sons are the patriarchs of the various tribes that constitute this nation. So it may be a little bit of an analogy in our nation when we talk about like the 50 states being the constituent groups of the United States. You can think of like the 12 tribes being kind of the constituent entities of this entire nation that is known by the name of its patriarch Jacob, who's called Israel. Because this is an event where the Lord was bringing this entire nation, a nation to which he had made great promises, including when he tells Jacob to go down to Egypt. The point was they're not going to stay in Egypt, but ultimately they're going to return to this promised land, to this land that Jacob had initially possessed in part. And the Lord is going to bring that whole nation back. So as the Lord is performing this action that brings his promise to completion, he is now going to have representatives from each of the 12 constituent tribes take a stone out of this river where the crossing happened, and that's going to be involved in setting up the memorial that will commemorate this event.
All right, so the instructions are given from the Lord to Joshua in the first 3 verses, and then we see a continuation of a pattern that we've already seen developed. After the Lord speaks to Joshua, now Joshua speaks to the people, and he's got these 12 men from the people of Israel. These were referenced in the previous text in chapter 3, verse 12. The Lord had told Joshua, "Now therefore take 12 men from the tribes of Israel." Here we're finding out what their purpose is. What does Joshua tell these 12 men to do as the text continues in chapter 4?
All right. So now what's going to happen is they are going to go into the middle of the Jordan River, and they're going to get a stone out from the now exposed riverbed, because you remember all the water had piled up in a great heap, as it's described in chapter 3, right? It's all been cut off, and so now the entire riverbed is exposed. That's why the people are passing on dry ground. So as we might see, if you see like a river like in a drought stage, and you can actually start to see the bed. Some of our listeners who might live primarily in the western part of the United States might see that a bit more frequently. You'll see that often there's like boulders or stones of various sorts there. So where that Ark of the Covenant had been held up by the priests, that now these representatives from each tribe are going to pick up a stone from that area, and they're going to take it out of the Jordan River, and that's what they're going to use to make the monument that Joshua has been instructed to do. Now, of course, Joshua's gotten these instructions, but if he doesn't tell the people what to do, they have no idea. Remember, it's not as if the Lord thundered, the instructions out and everybody got to hear it. there are times occasionally in the scriptures where the Lord does something like that. It's not very frequent, but every once in a while we can find places where he speaks publicly like that. But most often he speaks through what we would call spokespeople, whether they be prophets, in this case, leaders of the nation, kind of like Moses was. Now Joshua was taking that role. So the Lord is speaking through Joshua, and now Joshua's passing on the instructions to the people who are going to carry them out.
All right. So before we move on from these instructions, you're describing what the bottom of a riverbed might look like, and you used the word boulder. And in the text, it says to take up each of you a stone upon his shoulder. So I'm just curious what you think, Pastor Zimmerman, in terms of how big should we picture these stones when we try to imagine this scene? What are you picturing in your mind?
When I picture it in my mind, you're probably going to be looking at something that might resemble. I don't know. I know at our church here we have like a water softener, and you've got like those bags of water softener salt, right? Okay. And normally, I mean, you kind of pick it up and you kind of set it on your shoulder so you can carry it. So probably kind of more or less a maybe even kind of a rectangular sort of stone. It would be, of course, at the bottom of a river, it's being eroded, of course, because the water's flowing over it, but probably something like that.
Okay.
At least in my mind, that's
sure.
what it would probably look like.
Well, I'm just curious because it's hard to. I mean, when it says over your shoulder, yeah, I think of a bag of potting soil or something like
sure.
that you throw over your shoulder, something hefty that one man can lift on his own. It does seem that they act on their own like that, so that it will create, in the end, a monument that can be seen, that will stand out. That's going to be part of it. So, okay, I appreciate that because I want us to be able to picture this in our minds as much as possible. So they've got these stones from the river. In verse 8, again, with this pattern that we're seeing, the Lord has spoken to Joshua, Joshua has spoken to the people, and now the people do what Joshua commands. So far in the book of Joshua, this has been a great pattern. It's nice to see the people of Israel not in the rebellion that we so often associate them with, but here they're actually believing the Lord's word. They're doing the Lord's word, just as Joshua says. They take these 12 stones from the midst of the Jordan, and they carry them over where they're lodging. They lay the stones down. So we haven't yet built this memorial. That's still coming. But in verse 9, now Joshua does something that the Lord hadn't talked about before. He sets up 12 stones, and this is in the midst of the Jordan, so in the river. What's going on in verse 9? What's Joshua up to?
Now, this is one of those things that kind of presents a little bit of a mystery to us as we're reading it. Because you kind of read it along, it's like, okay, good. All right, so we're going to get stones, one person from each tribe. We're going to carry it out. And so that's going to become a memorial. And now Joshua set up stones. Well, are these like the same stones that the people were to pick up? Like as if Joshua designated the stones? It's like, okay, these 12 right here. Well, the problem is that's not really indicative of the kind of natural reading of verse 9, because in verse 9, it speaks about these stones that Joshua set up are actually still there, apparently, if you kind of read the end of verse 9. So, all right, that option kind of goes out the window when we think that way. Perhaps Joshua thought about making his own monument. That's an interesting idea, but we don't have an instruction to him to do that. We could think maybe this is like where the Ark of the Covenant was supposed to stand, almost as if maybe Joshua set up some pavement kind of area, stone pavement. Using the stones from the bottom of the riverbed, and that's what the priest would have stood on. So it's kind of like a little bit of a platform kind of thing. I mean, interesting idea. Again, not necessarily definitive of what happened. But there's something to this where the place where the Ark of the Covenant was in the middle of the Jordan River bed is marked. And it appears from the text that site marking from the basis of the end of verse 9 was kept there for a while. To this day, it's always hard because that just means to the day that this text was written down,
right?
Or compiled, or published, however it's referred to. So it's like, well, I mean, is it possible that they're not there anymore? Sure, because it's to the day of like the writing. But as we think about this, though, as we think about this river crossing, we are talking about a divine act being marked, both by the memorial that's going to be set up and the very fact that you had the Ark of the Covenant in the middle of the river. Mm. And all of us who are Christians, who think about the work of the Messiah, of the Christ, we are always thinking of the actions and events that the Lord incarnate, the Lord in the flesh, carries out. And when we think of the times of Jesus and the events of Jesus and the works of Jesus and the words of Jesus, they are all tied to events, activities, words from what we call the Old Testament. We should just call the scriptures that came before him.
Yeah.
And you really kind of think that maybe there's something about that the Lord had this spot marked. Again, a bit speculative, I will grant.
Yeah.
But perhaps that the Lord had this place marked so that when he appeared in the flesh as the Christ, that this is the place where he would go. When he kind of recapitulates all the Israelite history and is baptized, and he's kind of like the human Ark of the Covenant in a way of speaking.
Mm. That's the kind of thing that I would really, really like to be true.
Yes.
But as you said, we can't know.
And of course, it's Yeshua who's setting it up, right?
That's right.
Yes. I mean, out of all the people who are setting it up, it's one who bears the same name, right? Yeah. I mean, would love it to be true. And this is the way that often you would see some of the early church writers speak about things like this, which sometimes they seem to be maybe a little more in tune with what we call the Old Testament than sometimes we are, which is one of the great reasons why we do this sharper iron stuff, to actually sharpen our iron in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
That tells us what the Messiah was going to accomplish.
Right. Yeah. What a interesting, fantastic thought that the first Joshua would mark the spot where the second Joshua, the final Joshua, comes and stands in the Jordan River when he is baptized and begins that journey leading, the people of God of every time and every place into the promised land through his death and resurrection. I mean, there's tons of theological truth to that. We talked a little bit about this yesterday with the Ark of the Covenant being the presence of God among the people, and how Jesus being God incarnate, he is the one who leads us. And so theologically, I think the imagery is fantastic. And as pastors sometimes say, that will preach. But historically and geographically, and even textually, is that precisely what Joshua is doing with these stones? That's where we have to say that's speculative.
Yeah, I mean, it could be. I mean, I think there's a way you can read the actual text that Joshua may have actually designated the 12 stones that the other people pick up. I mean, there is a way you can read it as if Joshua had set up 12 stones, and the stones are there today. Not that they are in the middle of the Jordan River to this day, but they are at the Gilgal place to this day. I mean, I think there's a way you can read it that way, but it just might be that Joshua decided to set up his own monument too. I mean, I'm afraid we might not have a definitive answer here.
Certainly. And that, if it is Joshua setting up his own monument, he's certainly not out of line with other saints in the Old Testament who set up a monument, on their own. You can think of, for example, Jacob at Bethel is maybe the one that comes to mind first and foremost, that this happens throughout the Old Testament. And even what God commands, is something certainly that God does command elsewhere in the Old Testament to set up a memorial. So for Joshua to take this initiative, if you want to think about it like that, and to do it himself is not out of bounds by any means. And again, a number of ways of thinking about this theologically that certainly point us to Christ. So we'll go ahead and take our break there. That's a good place to stop. We've got plenty more to look at with this text. You're listening to Sharper Iron on KFUO. We're talking about Joshua 4 with Pastor Luke Zimmerman. We will be right back. Please stick around.
Did you know that Lutherans are helping new American immigrants get settled? How about struggling church workers in need of support and refreshment? And we assist at-risk children and provide disaster response to hurricane victims. Through LCMS recognized service organizations, we are doing all this and more. I'm Rahema Kavuga of Lutheran Church Extension Fund, and I don't want you to miss out on hearing what your brothers and sisters in Christ are up to. Visit interesttime.org to see how your support gives life to these works of mercy and love.
What do you think of when you hear the word college? Expensive? Liberal? Woke? Imagine a college that is affordable, a college that is unapologetically conservative and Lutheran, a college that won't take a dime of federal funding, a college that teaches the best of our Western heritage, a college where students grow in the Christian faith instead of leaving it behind. This is Luther Classical College, a college by Lutherans and for Lutherans. Visit our website, lutherclassical.org, subscribe, become a patron, and join the thousands who are making Luther Classical College a reality.
Welcome back to Sharper Iron. It is Thursday, October 13th. We're studying Joshua chapter 4, verses 1 to 24 with Pastor Luke Zimmerman. He serves at Calvary Evangelical Lutheran Church in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. Pastor Zimmerman, prior to the break, we were talking about Joshua's monument in the Jordan River. As the text continues, again, we've got the priests standing there in the midst of the Jordan until everything's finished. So as long as they're standing there, the water's still piling up in a heap. They're still walking through on dry ground. We get a bit more of the description as to how that actually happens. Again, we've been learning different details about this event all along in the text. And in the middle of verse 10, we find out the people are passing over in haste. So we get a little bit of information about the actual crossing, and then about some of these, the 3 Trans-Jordan tribes, or 2.5 Trans-Jordan tribes. Some more information about them. Take us into verses 10 and following.
All right. The biggest kind of thing is that, to kind of begin with, is like this river crossing, which is being facilitated and run by the Lord himself, is not going to be a perpetual crossing. Okay, so the Jordan River is going to go back to its natural state. The Lord has interrupted the natural state of the Jordan River so that his people can get across. But it's just to happen as long as necessary. It's a temporary thing. So once everybody's crossed the river, all the reason for the Jordan River to be piled up in a heap and stopped, it has now come to an end. Now it's time to actually bring it back to its natural state. That's what's happening with having the people not just like dawdle and well, of course they don't have cell phones and mobile phones to take all the pictures of it and things like that. But
there are no selfies taken in the middle of the Jordan River.
No selfies in the Jordan. That's right. But there's no gawking either. It's okay. We're making a beeline across, and there should be really kind of perhaps that kind of like energy towards it, because they're going into the land that was promised them. I mean, they're not meant to be on the other side of the Jordan from where they were crossing. They're meant to be on the side of the Jordan where they are crossing to. Okay, so the people move in haste, and they're moving all the way across. And then after that happens, what is going to now take place is that we got to get the group assembled, right? You got this kind of mass of humanity going across, but now we're going to have to get everything in its proper order again. And you see some of the description about what this proper order was for the people. Included in these verses, kind of verses 11, 12, and 13, are some information, data points given about, as you mentioned, 2.5 tribes of the Israelites. One of the things that happened, if you read in the book of Numbers, and that's where we first encounter it. So our listeners can go to Numbers chapter 32, and they will read some interesting things about the members of the tribes of Reuben and Gad. Now, these are 2 of the 12. And what was interesting is as the people of Israel were reaching close to the promised land, which is to be the west side of the Jordan, there were some of the Israelites who found the territory and landscape on the east side of the Jordan to be very conducive to them. And they wanted to stay there. And they kind of chose to stay there. But when you read in Numbers 32, there's a bit of an issue. Because if you have 2 of the tribes staying over there and then add another half tribe of Manasseh, you've now lost a significant percentage of your group, right? 1/6 plus a half of a 12th, right? So we go. I was told there was no math on this exam.
Yeah, no math today.
But you are losing a portion. And one of the things that Moses, when he speaks to these people from the tribes, is that, okay, we can keep you over here. We can have you take possession of that territory, but if you're staying on that side of the Jordan actually causes all your other brothers, the other tribes, to begin to fear and say, oh, we're not going to be able to take possession of the land the Lord promised to us, you're kind of complicit in bringing that about. So he kind of strikes an agreement with them, saying, when we get to the time that we're going to take possession of the land fully, which is going to be on that west side of the Jordan, y'all are coming along with us until that land is possessed. And then you can go back to the territories that will be yours. But you're not just like dropping anchor there and say, okay, good luck to the rest of you 10, right? Or 9.5, or things like that. So there's an agreement in outlined in Numbers chapter 32, which, when we read the beginning of the book of Joshua, in Joshua chapter 1, that Joshua, when he takes command of the Israelites, takes that leadership position succeeding Moses, he tells those same tribes, okay, this is the deal, right? Okay, you are coming with us until your brothers, also take possession of the land that is supposed to belong to them, too. Okay, then you can go back. So these groups, which are listed in verses 12 and 13 in chapter 4, are those what end up being called the Transjordan tribes. That's one of the ways they're referred to as we discuss the Old Testament. And they are ready for battle, though. They're ready in case their brothers, the rest of the tribes of Israel, will encounter resistance as they are making this trip across the river. They're ready to go. And this was part of the deal. This was part of the covenant arrangement, that you were not having tribes abandoning other tribes.
Right. And what strikes me about the mention here again, because we've seen this in Joshua chapter 1, is that it is a reminder at this point in the book of Joshua that battle is coming. That's what it says in verse 13. So get ready, because battle is coming. And yet it's also quite striking that really is taking a back seat for the time being, and to see the faithfulness of the Lord in leading his people across the Jordan River. And then in chapter 5, as we'll look at tomorrow, how there's still more things that need to be done from a religious perspective before any battle can be waged. It's just it's a striking reminder how the Lord puts first things first. He wants his people to remain faithful to him first and foremost, and he'll take care of the battle part, as we will see in the book of Joshua. So you get that reminder of what's coming, and yet still the Lord keeps first things first for his people, showing them that he is the one leading them across. He's the one who's going to fight and to drive out their enemies before him. This juncture, it seems to emphasize that.
Yeah, very much so. It is that the Lord is giving the protection, but part of the protection that he is giving is also tied to his people abiding by the guidance and instructions that he has given to them. When they do try to strike out on their own, and they come up with their own ideas of how they're going to do things, not going to work. Okay, but as they are abiding by the instructions that the Lord has given, and given through the spokespeople, given through Moses, and now Joshua, then things do go well for the people.
So take us now into verse 14, where the Lord exalts Joshua in the sight of all Israel. This was one of the purposes that the Lord had revealed back in chapter 3, and we see its fulfillment here.
Yeah, so there are some parallels to the life of Moses. If we think back in like the book of Exodus and Numbers as well, in the wilderness, right? There are times when Moses' authority, his status as the leader whom the Lord had appointed, has to be reinforced. Now, sometimes it has to be reinforced because it's being challenged by external people. For example, that's kind of the setup with all the plagues and the wonders that are worked in Egypt. That's where we're dealing with resistance from those who are outside of the group, right? Pharaoh and his people are not in Israel, so there's a challenge in that sense. And that's why, like, the signs and wonders that the Lord performs through Moses helps reinforce both, of course, the Lord's status as supreme, but then Moses as his designated leader. But then there's also times when we got resistance from inside the group. Yeah, what I call like intramural resistance, right? That would be like, we don't want to follow Moses anymore. Moses is a lousy leader, right? He's getting us lost, or his own family, right? Miriam and Aaron even get involved with some of it too, right? And what the Lord would do is, through certain acts that would be allowed for Moses to be performed, or performed through Moses, Moses' position as the Lord's anointed or appointed leader was shown. In this case, you got kind of the same thing working with Joshua. And the Lord did say in Joshua 3, "Today I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all of Israel, that they may know that as I was with Moses, so I will be with you." And one of the ways that lesson is going to be learned is going to be like, all right, you're going to have the same group of people who got taken through water by Moses. Now, of course, it's the Lord working through Moses, right? Are now 40-some years later, right, being led through water by the person the Lord appointed, in this case, Joshua.
So the person appointed, Joshua, gets more instructions from the Lord in verses 15 and following, which again, we were seeing this pattern. And now we're drawing to the end of this actual event of the crossing of the Jordan River. What does the Lord tell Joshua to do? How does he pass that on to the people in verses 15 and following?
All right, the Lord's going to say, all right, the Ark of the Covenant isn't staying here in the middle of the Jordan riverbed forever. That's not where it's supposed to be. So the priests who are carrying it, they're going to have to come out of that riverbed onto the banks. And that's what Joshua then tells the priests to do. And when that ark starts moving, you can kind of envision it in your mind. They start moving, they're getting closer and closer to the bank, and then their feet start hitting the dry ground on the outside of the riverbed. And all the priests, the last ones carrying kind of the back of the ark, right, on the poles, right, and they get up out of the riverbed. That whole purpose for the river to stop flowing has now been completed. It goes back to its natural state, and the Lord's people are now all safely on the other side of the Jordan. And it's kind of marking that's when the Lord's activity, his direct action that was causing this temporary situation for the benefit of his people, now that action is coming to a close.
All right. So
and it's kind of like when Moses did it with the Red Sea. Yeah, I mean, it's the same. Again, there are these echoes of the Red Sea crossing all in the Jordan crossing. So, Moses stretches out the hand over the sea, and then it goes back to its own place. But in this case, you don't have like a whole bunch of drowned soldiers, right?
That's right.
Which was, okay, you're not getting that, but there are the echoes. The water was stopped. Now it's flowing again.
That's right. Yeah. Well, and the fact that there are no drowned soldiers here, we talked a little bit about this yesterday, that there is a, that adds a different perspective to this water event than, say, the Red Sea crossing, because, the enemies have been defeated. And granted, there are enemies on the other side of the Jordan, but this is, I guess this has that element of the Lord is fulfilling his promise and bringing you into the promised land finally here. That just is, that aspect is emphasized more in this text than with the water crossing of the Red Sea, I think.
It is. Yeah, the Red Sea crossing is a deliverance. I mean, that's actually kind of, in some ways, we could almost even argue that's the freeing from the slavery. Right? The enslavers want one more crack at the Israelites, right? Yeah, we let them go. Oh, can't have that big mistake. Let's go get them, right? And the Lord removes those enslavers. He gets his full glory over Pharaoh and his host. Where in this case, this is like the Jordan River is just kind of like, in some ways, the portal through which the Lord is bringing his people through into the promised land. It's a little bit different. It's not really rescue. It's not rescue or deliverance as much as the Lord is making completely good on the promise that he had made. He is establishing his people in their new homeland. He's not getting them out of the place where they were stuck. He's getting them into the place where they were always supposed to go. Yeah. It's like an entrance right in many ways.
Yeah. It's what a wonderful way for the Lord to do it. As you said, bookends here for their journey, and now it's like we're going to get started. Here is the beginning, the new birth that began 40 years ago, and now the Lord is bringing to completion through this water crossing over the Jordan River. So we find out the time of year that it is in verse 19 and 20, and then the actual setting up at a place called Gilgal. Again, so they're through the river now. What happens now that they're on the other side? What's the significance of the timing?
Okay. As if there weren't enough echoes of the Exodus, right? As we're reading this, the author makes it even more clear. So you can't miss it. I need to tell you when this happened, right? It happened on the 10th day of the first month. And all of us who have read the books of Moses are like, where did we encounter that before? I know we've heard that time marker at some point, right? And of course, some of our real smart listeners will be like, yeah, that's the Exodus, right? That's Exodus 12. That's the Passover. That's when you were supposed to go get the lamb, right? And then you would have the lamb in your house for a few days, and then you would slaughter it on the 14th, right? I mean, it's like, yes, exactly right. It is carrying that echo of the Passover preparations. And in fact, as we're going to see in our next episode, when we deal with chapter 5, is you're going to see that the Passover meal, once again, is actually held, because it wasn't held during the Exodus. You had the one, the very first Passover, and then when they get into the promised land, when they get into the land that they were going to possess, that's when you would have that memorial meal every year at this time. So that's hanging over this entire event. In a kind of similar way, not identical, but not not disconnected. What Joshua then has the people do at Gilgal, which is the place where they lodge, is now we're going to take those stones and we're going to set up the monument. Now, what that looked like, we don't know.
I was going to ask you,
were they all piled together? Are we thinking kind of like a Stonehenge thing, like 12? We don't know. In some ways, it might actually be the idea of like 12 in a circle, though. And this has to do with a little bit of the Gilgal word, which, if I remember right, is like connected kind of etymologically to like rolling and circle kind of things. And quite frankly, that would be one pretty decent monument. I'll just say, naturally, we don't usually see 12 stones in a circle when you're just like wandering around anywhere. We have lots of stones here in Pennsylvania, and if you go up on like the Appalachian Trail or some places like that, you just don't naturally have 12 stones in a circle. It just doesn't happen, right? So that could be what the monument actually was, and I guess that would be sort of tied to the Gilgal, even kind of like etymology. But the key thing with the monument, even if we don't know what it looks like, is that this becomes, though, when the people would see it, and if they ever returned to this site, they would be able to have a remembrance similar to what they would have done every year in their own houses at the Passover. And in fact, kind of the language is that way, right? You're reading along in verse 21, and Joshua said to the people of Israel, when your children ask their fathers in times to come, what do these stones mean, right? And it's kind of like, at the Passover, right? Why is this night different than every other night, right? You have that kind of catechetical question and answer form of learning. Yep. Which we still do even in our day, right?
What does this mean?
Was ist das, right? What is this? Your children can be told by you, right? And that's important. You shall let your children know, which means that story, the narrative, the details are passed from one generation to the next. And that's the way it works. That's the way the Lord's ways are passed down. One generation tells the next one. And that might be natural generations, parents and children, or it might be generations in the sense you've got new converts, new people added in, right? And then they get to tell the subsequent ones. And they're going to say, you can say, Israel passed over this Jordan on dry ground. Here, this is where it happened, right? This is where the Lord your God dried up the waters. This is where you passed over. Kind of like you got to pass over the Red Sea, but none of us are going back over between Egypt and Arabia to find that spot. That's not where we belong. we belong here in this land. And this is where the Lord took us into this land that he gave to us. And now, when we recount this, we're going to talk about the mighty hand of the Lord. We're going to talk about this wasn't a natural occurrence, right? We didn't wait until the dry season in the Jordan you could kind of like wade through. It was at flood stage. The Lord stopped everything. It happened when we took the Ark of the Covenant into the middle of it. We all got to cross on the other side. Then the Ark of the Covenant got carried out, and all the flood waters rushed back again. But this was how the Lord got us into this land he had promised to give to us.
And then at the very end of this text, we find out the Lord's purpose and his desired result. And even, the asking by the children to their fathers, I think is a part of all of this. The Lord's desire in doing this is that all the peoples of the earth may know who he is, that his hand is mighty, that people would fear him. And by fear him, we mean trust in him. That's the Old Testament way of speaking about faith, essentially. And that's what the Lord's up to here, is to give his people faith, but also to call out to all the world that he's the true God, so that they too would put their fear and their faith in him.
It is. And the encountering of this ancient religion that would be recorded in books, right, would be read in all the cities. Isn't that not right? In the even in the book of Acts, in the Jerusalem Council, right? And part of the book of Acts. I mean, you've got places where you would even have Gentiles becoming kind of familiar with some of the accounts or narratives of this Yahweh God that this group of people worshipped. And I mean, he does some interesting things, right? And that is one of those things that as these narratives are recounted and we talk about what these deities do. Now, we're going to talk about false deities, all right? When you talk about, read like the narratives of like some of the other religions and what they're up to, what their deities are up to, and then you compare it to what Yahweh, the Lord God, does. And you see different character, different abilities, different purposes. The Lord uses his power to benefit people primarily. Expressions of deliverance, right? He's not just coming down and using his power to do kind of whatever he wants and collect all sorts of stuff for himself and maybe irritate some other group, some other god or something. No. He's got a promise. He's trustworthy. He keeps those promises forever. He remembers the things. He exercises his power over the heavens and earth, the waters, the seas, everything in them, because he's the one who made them. All those kind of traits and things are brought forward as these narratives of what the Lord does are recounted. And that's not just for those who are descendants of Jacob physically. It's also for these other nations that they might hear and also come to believe in this same Lord.
That's right. With about a minute here, Pastor Zimmerman, help us to wrap up. How do we see Jesus in Joshua 4?
How do we see Jesus in Joshua 4?
With a minute.
With a minute. All right. You're going to talk about he's going to be baptized in there. He's going to be the Ark of the Covenant in there, his presence. But ultimately, what is his presence in the world to do? It's actually to take us into the place, the new heavens, new earth, the land that's actually meant for us. And so the crossing of the Jordan actually becomes one of the ways that we poetically can speak about how Jesus brings us over into the world to come. We see that used in like Christian poetry and literature, hymns and things like that. There's with good reason we say it. So maybe that might be a good classical way and keep the classic ways going in our generations as we talk about what the Lord does.
Yes, our Lord Jesus Christ takes us through the Jordan River and into the promised land of eternity with him. Pastor Luke Zimmerman is pastor at Calvary Evangelical Lutheran Church in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, helping us today with Joshua 4, verses 1 to 24. Pastor Zimmerman, thanks for being our guest today.
Always great to be a guest.
I am your host here on Sharper Iron, Pastor Timothy Appel of Grace Lutheran Church in Smithville, Texas. If you have any questions about Joshua, send an email to kfuo@kfuo.org. It is always a pleasure to hear from you. Thanks for spending the morning with us. Talk to you again tomorrow.